In 2001, WCW was on its last legs, and it's an understatement to say that the company was well past its glory days. It's funny now to look back on the embarrassing moments that occurred during the tail end of the company's lifespan, but in real time, it was those very embarrassing moments that caused many viewers to lose faith in the product. Those fed up viewers either switched over to watching the WWF or stopped watching wrestling completely. Before WCW was sold to their Monday Night War rival Vince McMahon, there were numerous attempts to keep WCW alive, but to no avail. We all know how the invasion angle went, which only further served as a reminder that WCW was dead, and that was that, right? But what if I told you that WWE had plans to relaunch WCW that ultimately failed?
Like a bunch of narcotics. Pull up in that new.
On January 10, 2000, Time Warner was bought by AOL for $182 million. The two companies would merge together to form the world's largest media conglomerate. The vision the media giants held was to create the greatest media empire ever, and by combining Time Warner's media portfolio along with their production skills with AOL's 30 million subscribers, it was possible. Problem was, though, WCW was not a part of AOL and Time Warner's new vision. The heads of the media conglomerate weren't fond of WCW, especially not as fond of it as billionaire Ted Turner. But once this merger happened, Ted Turner no longer had any control over whether or not WCW would continue being a mainstay on Turner Broadcasting, which meant that WCW had lost its biggest backing. And you can't necessarily blame AOL and Time Warner for not being the biggest supporters of WCW, when the ratings for the company were constantly getting worse and worse, and WCW was losing millions of dollars. It's been estimated that in 2000, WCW lost anywhere between 50 to 70 million, which meant that WCW was an extremely huge financial drain on the company, and at the end of the day, business is business. It didn't matter how much WCW meant to its fans or the wrestling world, if it wasn't making them any profit, AOL and Time Warner didn't see the need to keep something that was heavily draining their pockets around. There had been rumors floating around for months by the end of 2000 that WCW was going to be sold, but Turner Broadcasting had constantly denied these rumors. By the beginning of 2001, the ownership for WCW was up for grabs, and let's just say that it didn't fall into steady hands until Vince McMahon bought it. On January 11, 2001, it was announced that Fusient Media had purchased WCW for around $75 million, and with Eric Bischoff partnering together with Brian Badal, there were huge plans to get WCW back on its feet and move in a positive direction. Remember this? With this $75 million deal, the plan was to keep airing WCW on the Turner Network. But remember how I said that AOL and Time Warner were not the biggest supporters of WCW? Well, that was a huge understatement. AOL Time Warner did not like WCW. They didn't really like wrestling at all, to be honest, and in that vision that I mentioned that they held earlier, WCW being off of their TV stations was a part of that vision. When it came to airing WCW programming on the Turner Network, they essentially said this to Fusient Media.
Get somebody else to do it.
And since the deal wasn't completely set in stone, on March 20th, Fusient Media completely backed out because what was the point in purchasing WCW if there was nowhere to air it? This was 2001. There was no Hulu, Netflix, HBO Max, or Paramount Plus. I know Eric Bischoff was in shambles when he heard this news. I kind of feel bad for him because he was putting all this effort in to keep WCW alive, and just when he thought that was going to potentially happen, the deal went up in smoke. Fast forward some time later, on Friday, March 23, 2001, the WWF, WCW's competitor in the Monday Night Wars, had made the announcement that they were purchasing WCW. WWE had purchased the rights and the trademarks to WCW from a desperate AOL and Time Warner who wanted it off their hands for $2.5 million, and later went on to purchase the rights to the videotape library for $1.7 million, thus making the grand total come out to around $4.2 million. Vince McMahon was now the owner of WCW, and the Monday Night Wars were officially over, and it only cost Vince $4.2 million, which is chump change for him, and the selling price was much lower than it was originally going to be bought for, and it's honestly still a little unbelievable. Contrary to how WCW was portrayed during the invasion angle, Vince McMahon had huge plans for the company. Eric Bischoff had stepped up to the plate and struck out, but it was now Vince's time to shine. When purchasing WCW, Vince had the intention of continuing WCW under the WWE umbrella, but WCW would act as a separate entity. Raw at the time was airing on TNN, aka Spike, and SmackDown was airing on UPN, while Nitro was going to air on a different station and potentially under a different time slot. It's said that creative had drawn up a story where Vince was going to have an on-screen affair with Tori Wilson, which would cause Linda McMahon to get a divorce from him, and Shane McMahon would side with his mother, and since he already owned WCW and kayfabe, the two of them would partner together and run the company. This storyline would essentially be a rehash or a part 2 to the wild storyline that happened a couple of months earlier with Trish Stratus and Vince McMahon, but instead of Trish being involved and Linda McMahon being sedated for the majority of the storyline, Tori Wilson in the control of WCW would be involved. We actually got to see some of this play out on TV through segments in 2001 with Vince McMahon and Tori Wilson, but it didn't progress very far and eventually got axed. With the WCW logo getting a new fresh coat of paint, it planned to put the program on TV, and a special WCW themed main event that was set to take place on the July 2nd edition of Raw's War, it looked like everything was falling into place, right? Unfortunately, no. Everything fell apart that night, and the landscape of the wrestling world never quite looked the same. The July 2nd, 2001 edition of Raw's War took place in Tacoma, Washington. Keep this in mind for later. The WWE scheduled the main event for this episode to take place between Buff Bagwell and Booker T for the World Heavyweight Championship. Besides who was wrestling in the main event, it was WCW themed, complete with the logo, the presentation, and even the announce team, which was comprised of Arn Anderson and Scott Hudson on commentary, and Stacy Keibler as the in-ring announcer. As Booker T and Buff Bagwell made their way to the ring, little did they know that almost 5 minutes was all it was going to take for this match to etch itself in wrestling history for all the wrong reasons. I decided to take it upon myself to watch this match because I never had before, and with the negative reputation this match has, I was expecting it to be terrible, but the thing is, it wasn't terrible at all. It was about as average as you could get for a TV match and simply just okay for 2001 standards. With the reputation this match had and the reaction of the Tacoma crowd towards this match where they thought it deserved a downpour of boos,
Get him out of the building. He went willingly, voluntarily. He wants the opportunity.
you would think that this is the Jackie Gator match, Scott Steiner versus Triple H, Pat Patterson versus Gerald Briscoe in an evening gown match levels of bad, but it isn't at all. But the reaction of the crowd was enough to help seal the fate of WCW, and Vince called it off. He was no longer going forward with his original plans. With Vince calling off his original plans for WCW, the direction of where this invasion angle was heading into was abandoned, and instead, what we were left with was an insanely huge missed opportunity for WWE, and WCW was dead. I don't believe the Buff Bagwell and Booker T match was solely responsible for Vince calling his plans off. I really believe there were other factors in play, but at the end of the day, the reaction this match received didn't help WCW's chances of staying alive at all. The Tacoma, Washington crowd is definitely something, and let me just say something real quick. This match wasn't bad enough to receive this type of reaction from them.
The fact is the crowd can't help it. They can turn the tide of emotion, but they can't help it.
WCW was never going to have a real chance to shine when management decides to put on this WCW themed test for the crowd in an area that is heavily Team WWF, because this is an area that they heavily toured. The Tacoma crowd never had any intention of giving this match a real chance, especially when you notice about 30 seconds into the match, they're already jeering and booing. This sign just tells you the type of timing they were on that night. But I can't fully blame the Tacoma crowd for reacting the way that they did because of the ideology that WWE had pushed throughout the time of the Monday Night War. WWE had pushed the ideology that WWE equal good and WCW equal bad, and when you decide to run a WCW themed main event in your stomping grounds, of course the crowd isn't going to react positively to it when they've been conditioned to think that WCW is lower than WWE and that it'll never compare. You want to know something that's even crazier about this story? The very next episode of Raw's War took place in Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta, which is WCW's stomping grounds and where they would have fared much better. It was only 1 week later, so why couldn't WWE wait to put their test to the test? I guess we'll never know. So, what ended up happening to Buff Bagwell and Booker T after this match? Buff Bagwell wrestled his first, his final, and his only match in the WWE on that July 2nd episode of Raw. Booker T, on the other hand, did pretty well for himself as WWE saw the value in him, and eventually he was skyrocketing to the top of the card and was feuding with the likes of The Rock and Stone Cold Steve Austin. He eventually got really over with the fans, especially when he got paired together in the memorable tag team with him and Goldust after the brand split in 2002. But soon, things would take a turn for the worst.
Somebody like you doesn't get to be a world champion.
Give me a towel.
Yeah, unfortunately, my brother Booker T became a notorious victim of Triple H's reign of terror and wouldn't fully recover until his King Booker gimmick years later in 2006. When Vince McMahon purchased WCW in 2001, he had big plans for the company, which included WCW being aired on TV, and in kayfabe, the rivalry between the WWE and WCW would have continued. On that fateful July 2nd night, all of those plans were thrown out the window, and instead of potentially getting the good ending where WCW lived on, and the invasion angle actually lived up to its potential, we got the exact opposite. Just like Eric Bischoff, Vince McMahon stepped up to the plate, swung, and struck out. Actually, in Vince McMahon's mind, it was WCW who stepped up to the plate and swung and struck out, not him. I want to know you guys' thoughts on all this. Do you think Vince McMahon gave WCW a fair chance, or do you think the idea was destined to always fail? I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Don't forget to hit the like button, and if you want more content about the Attitude Era and the Ruthless Aggression Era, to hit the subscribe button. I'm GG, and that was the WCW Failed Relaunch.